The Cold War took place between the US and the Soviet Union beginning in 1947. There was no actual fighting in the war, but rather a power struggle between the two nations' ideologies. Joseph Stalin led the USSR into the Cold War. Stalin was known as a fierce dictator that sought to expand communism and the Soviets' power. When Stalin died in 1953, it was up to the Communist Party to continue his vision of Soviet power. The United States had 9 presidents serve and manage the Cold War. Each of them had different policies, but the main goal was to stop the spread of communism and to be more powerful than the Soviets. One way each country tried to prove that they were better was through military power. Each country tried to stock up on nukes and other powerful new military technology. As a result, the fear of a nuclear attack also rose during the era. The arms race continued throughout the Cold War, and some may argue that it still continues today. One result of the arms race would be the space race. The Soviets struck first in the space race by sending up the first satellite, Sputnik, having the first animal in space, and having the first person to orbit the globe. President John F. Kennedy was tired of being beat by the Soviets, so he decided that the US should shoot for the moon. And on July 20th, 1969, Apollo 11 landed on the moon, and Neil Armstrong became the first person to walk on the moon. Without the competition during the Cold War, who knows how long it would have taken to put a man on the moon. Another way the United States fought the Cold War was through containment. The United States drafted specific policies like the Marshall Plan and the Truman Doctrine to help stop and contain communism. The United States also wanted to stop the expansion of the USSR. The best way to do this was through NATO. NATO is a pact between the US and other Western countries. The agreement basically says if one member of NATO is attacked, they all must go help and defend. In response to NATO, the USSR created the Warsaw Pact, which is basically the communist version of NATO. The divide between Eastern and Western Europe became known as the Iron Curtain. The US also had to prepare to defend against a possible attack. One of the ways the US tried to defend was the economy. The domestic economic policies helped maximize national security. The US economy plan was to outproduce the Soviets. This would also help with the recovery in Europe. The Cold War had been very intense and aggressive in the 50s and 60s, but in the 70s and 80s, the Cold War started to slow down and lose its intensity. President Nixon had suggested a relaxation with the Soviet Union in 1972. Later in Nixon's term, the USSR and the United States had decided to limit the amount of nuclear missiles in their arsenals. Finally, in the 1980s, the Communist Party in Russia decided to change when Mr. Gorbachev came into power, and he was a more democratic-leaning leader than any other communist. Finally, the Cold War was coming to an official end when President Reagan told Mr. Gorbachev to tear down the Berlin Wall, and 2 years later, it was gone. Almost all Soviet power and influence in Western Europe was gone. The Cold War ended in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union. History will look back on the Cold War and see a lot of intensity, emotion, and fear of what could have happened. It can even be considered one of the most intense political times in history. The Cold War still can have an effect on us today, from pop culture to politics. The world will never forget about the Cold War.